Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Hitler's Great Gamble, a new look at German strategy, Operation Barbarossa, and the Axis defeat in World War II. By James Ellman, narrated by David Vries. Publisher's Note: this audiobook refers to images and tables included in the print and e-book editions of the book. Introduction. World War II was the supreme cataclysmic event in the history of mankind. It resulted in more than 70 million deaths, and the fighting raged across the globe from desert to Arctic to steppe to jungle to metropolis. Entire peoples were decimated, maps redrawn, great cities reduced to rubble, and the power of the atom unleashed, which heralded the possible extinction of our species. As such a monumental event, it is worthwhile to understand why the war happened and unfolded the way it did and influenced the world that emerged from its ashes. It is difficult to believe that after more than 70 years and the publication of a vast number of scholarly volumes regarding World War II, that there could be anything of import yet to write about the conflict. However, I believe that a few of the most important events of the period have been overlooked or misinterpreted. This volume will attempt to shed new light and analysis on two of the most crucial points of the war and argue the following. 1. That the Nazi Third Reich's attack on the USSR in 1941 was not a doomed act of madness or hubris, as many historians now conclude. Rather, it was a logical gamble that maximized Germany's chance of achieving its war goals and came extremely close to success. Other options presented to Hitler were considered and correctly discarded as unlikely to lead to victory. In November 1940, the German dictator offered his Soviet counterpart a deal to prevent or delay a conflict, but Stalin spurned the opportunity. Ideology, geographic ambitions, and a scramble for economic resources meant that war was probable between the two totalitarian powers once the buffer states between them had been ripped away. Hitler calculated that an attack on the USSR in 1941 was the time most likely to result in a Nazi victory and hegemony for his nation over Northern Europe. 2. That Germany's failure to conquer the Soviet Union was primarily due to other than the most commonly believed reasons. The defeat was not a result of a military that was too small to perform the task, a diversion in the Balkans that delayed the invasion, a severe Russian winter, the Nazis' evil ideology, or Hitler's refusal to listen to his generals and direct the focus of the invasion on an early capture of Moscow. No, the primary reason for the USSR's eventual triumph was a failure of Axis diplomacy. Germany failed to gain the offensive actions it needed from its allies, Finland and Japan, to achieve victory. As a result, all three went down to defeat. Had Hitler engaged in committed diplomatic and military coordination with his partners, it is difficult to see how the USSR could have survived. To understand the 2 points before, we must understand why the war occurred. Most historians agree that the cause of World War II was the militarism and expansionist aims of Italy, Japan, and Germany. Without Germany's support, Italy and its ineffective military would never have been able to wage a conflict of great import and geographic scope. Without Germany's 1940 land victories over France, the Netherlands, and Britain, it is unlikely that Japan would have been able to achieve such smashing triumphs prior to its fiery ruin. Thus, it was the power of Germany that allowed a handful of regional grievances and conflicts to become a world at war. So, what were Adolf Hitler's goals? Answering that question will tell us why World War II happened the way it did, and, to a great extent, it was the decisions made by the German dictator from 1939 to 1942 that shaped the 20th century world that followed. There are several competing theories as to why Germany sparked the conflict known as World War II. Was it to right the wrongs of the Treaty of Versailles after a great war in which both sides were equally at fault? Was it to refight and win World War I? Was it to exterminate the Jews and other peoples despised by a warped Nazi ideology? Or was it even bigger than that? Was it an outright attempt to conquer the world? This book argues that Hitler's goals become clearer when viewed from a geopolitical viewpoint and with an analysis of his published writing. Simply stated, he wished to secure Germany as the dominant nation in Northern Europe and have it achieve great power status. Hitler was a murderous megalomaniac, but his declared objective for Germany was Lebensraum, or living space, not conquest of the entire planet. After all, he was willing to assign great swaths of the globe to his allies, demanded no territory of the British Empire, and endeavored to avoid disputes with the United States. This does not mean a realization of his goals would be peaceful. At a minimum, France and Poland would have to be militarily defeated and forcibly dismembered. If Britain, the USSR, and the United States opposed Hitler's plans, as was likely, then the dramatically larger combined GDP and populations of these enemies would overwhelm the Third Reich. Thus, to achieve his objectives, Hitler had to find a way through diplomacy, bluster, and strategy to keep these three great powers from combining against Germany. Despite an evil, false, and genocidal ideology, Hitler's territorial goals were effectively the same as those of Germany in World War I. For over a decade, he played an exquisitely successful strategic game and came remarkably close to achieving a sustainable victory. Evaluated in this light, World War II looks significantly different compared to the common belief that the Nazis were striving for nothing less than global conquest. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 becomes obvious from a German point of view. It needed to defeat its enemies sequentially, as it could not stand against all of them at once. The invasion of Russia in June 1941 also appears significantly more rational and well-timed. It was a calculated gamble rather than a great mistake. What otherwise would seem to be uncharacteristic forbearance shown by Hitler toward the belligerents of the United States and President Roosevelt is clearly logical under this analysis. There are entire books dedicated to enumerating long lists of Hitler's mistakes. Of these errors, the consensus is that the greatest was the German attack on the USSR on June 22, 1941. Consider the following quotes regarding the invasion from esteemed historians Ian Kershaw, Niall Ferguson, Drew Middleton, Joachim Fest, Norman Rich, and William Shirer. The decision looks like a death wish for himself and his nation. It is a truth almost universally acknowledged that the attack on the Soviet Union was Hitler's fatal mistake. Hitler's decision to invade Russia was the product of the convictions and illusions of the dictator's demonic psyche. The decision to attack the Soviet Union even before the war in the West was decided has often been viewed as one of Hitler's blind, puzzling, or hardly comprehensive resolves. His decision to launch the war in the East at this particular time resembled an act of desperation. The German attack on Russia in 1941 has been called the greatest blunder of the Second World War. The destruction of the Soviet Union came first. This, we can now see, was a staggering blunder. The majority of German casualties took place in crushing defeats in the East, so a conclusion that the invasion was a mistake seems reasonable. Nevertheless, Part 1 of this book will respectfully argue a different opinion. That an analysis of geopolitics, German war aims, and facts on the ground show that the invasion of the USSR was not a mistake. It was a gamble, yes, and a huge one at that, but one in which the odds were calculated and distinctly in Hitler's favor. Yes, Germany lost and the USSR won. Nevertheless, Hitler seized on the moment that maximized his chance of victory and minimized Stalin's. German military power was at its height, while that of the Soviet Union was at a low point. Germany started the invasion brimming with confidence and with willing allies ready to commit blood and treasure to the cause. The USSR was alone, ringed by enemies, and seething with internal dissent in the wake of the murder of millions of its citizens in Stalin's purges and mass forced starvations. Germany's position versus its larger eastern neighbor was starkly more advantageous in 1941 compared to that in 1914. We should recall that in 1914 to 1917, the Germans successfully defeated and dismembered Russia, and so hopes of a repeat victory were reasonable rather than delusional. Many have made the case that Hitler should have left the USSR alone and focused on other military options available to Germany in 1941. However, this book will attempt to show that these other options were fraught with risk and unlikely to succeed. In addition, if pursued, their failure could place the Third Reich in a position of great disadvantage if the USSR subsequently chose to attack. Hitler knew Stalin had engaged in discussions to ally his nation militarily with Germany's enemies before and after the war began. The ideologies of the Nazis and the Bolsheviks were diametrically opposed, and the two nations coveted many of the same territories. War between Germany and the USSR in the 1940s was all but inevitable. In 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm's government enumerated its war aims in the September Programme. One of these goals, the conquest of Western Russia, was achieved in 1917. Hitler made clear that he planned to refight and win World War I. He wrote in Mein Kampf that Germany should conquer the western half of the USSR in its quest to achieve great power status. Since 1919, the Soviet government had been supporting the Comintern, which fomented violent Bolshevik revolts across Western Europe. Certainly, a reading of the Moscow newspapers and communist theory would lead a rational German strategist to expect the Soviets to march west and conquer as much of Europe as possible at the first opportunity. An attempt had already been made to do this in 1920, but the Poles turned back the Red Army on the outskirts of Warsaw. Perhaps a German-Russian war could have been delayed past 1941. Peace could have been maintained for a time with Soviet acceptance of German preeminence in Europe. But Stalin engaged in his own aggressive territorial and diplomatic moves that brought the two totalitarian powers that much closer to war. The partition of Poland created a common frontier between the two great powers along which a clash of arms became possible. Stalin then ordered an invasion of the Baltics, which stationed Red Army troops on the German border for the first time. A slice of Romania was annexed, which advanced Soviet forces that much closer to Germany's primary source of petroleum. Finland was to be absorbed as yet another Soviet republic, and the flow of critical German imports from Scandinavia would then continue only on the whim of Stalin's caprice. War was coming. To Hitler, the question was only if it was to be fought on German or Russian soil. Part 2 will examine why the USSR triumphed over the German invaders. Not only the Nazi leadership, but most senior British, Japanese, and American military observers expected the Red Army to be defeated quickly. If nothing else, the almost universal international expectation of German success belies the argument that the Russian invasion was a foolhardy mistake. If Hitler was delusional that his army would conquer the USSR in the second half of 1941, then so too was the U.S. Secretary of War and the British Imperial General Staff. That is not how history played out, but the failure of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the USSR, was not preordained. Scholars have offered various arguments to explain the Nazi regime's defeat in the East. It was due to a failure of its military capabilities, or its logistics train, or Hitler's leadership, or the fury of the Russian people and their winter. Despite these criticisms, the Wehrmacht advanced with remarkable speed, destroyed army after army arrayed against it, and fought its way more than 900 miles into the USSR, to Leningrad, to Moscow, to Stalingrad. This volume will advance an explanation that has not been sufficiently explored. While the most famous image of World War II may be a diplomatic one of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin sitting together, little discussion has taken place arguing that the Soviet victory can be tied directly to a failure of German diplomacy and coordination with its allies. Had Hitler been able to cajole the Finns to advance further after their initial victories in 1941, and had Japan been persuaded to attack the USSR in the Far East, a Russian military collapse would have been all but assured. Even after the Wehrmacht was driven back from Moscow, a German victory over the USSR could still have been achieved in 1942 when the two sides were so evenly matched. The Finns and the Japanese fielded fresh legions massed close to Murmansk and Vladivostok, as well as the two railways leading from those ports. Critical shipments of US aid to the Red Army moved along these rails, yet Germany's allies failed to attack. The USSR stripped these quiet fronts of hundreds of thousands of troops to fight and defeat the Germans from the Baltic to the Volga, and then in the long campaign to Berlin. A note on the tone and viewpoint of this book. It attempts to analyze the military strategies of Germany and, within that context, the decisions of its dictator in the initial years of World War II. It is not a polemic against the evil of Hitler, nor an attempt to rank his homicidal policies against those of Stalin. Other books have done that in great detail and in a more compelling manner than I could ever hope to achieve. Goals. Part 1 of this book will attempt to persuade that the German attack on the USSR, generally viewed as a monumental blunder, was in fact a calculated, rational choice. In the context of achieving his nation's war aims, Hitler weighed the odds in 1941, concluded they were in his favor, and rolled the dice. He knew he was taking a great gamble in Russia, and his voiced fears, sleepless nights, and rapid increase in drug use belied the boastful promises of an easy victory he issued to larger audiences. Part 2 will attempt to show that while Hitler came tantalizingly close to victory in the USSR, it was primarily a failure of diplomacy rather than a deficiency in German military acumen or generalship that led to defeat. The cold of the winter, the fighting spirit of the Russian soldier, and the inability to take Moscow will always loom large in the German failure. Nevertheless, I hope to show that the choices made by Finland and Japan in 1941 to 1943 reveal the true proximate cause for Soviet victory. Part 1. The German Quest for Great Power Status and the Logic of Barbarossa. 1. The German Strategic Predicament and Hitler's Rise. As with all nations, geography has defined Germany's existence. The country sits on the western side of the European plain, a generally flat area broken up by forest and the rivers that flow primarily to the north, Baltic, and Black Seas. With no defining geographic barrier to stop armies, this region has repeatedly been one of the great battlefields of history. In the centuries before the creation of modern Germany, the plain provided an easy avenue for invasion and counterattack by the powers of the day. The Romans invaded from the west, and waves of tribal invaders flowed in from the steppe to the east. The Goths, Huns, Franks, Swedes, French, Prussians, and Russians all sent army after army back and forth across these lands. This geographic position was both Germany's greatest asset and its greatest weakness. As Northern Europe became the richest and most powerful part of the world after 1600, Germany's central position on the continent placed it strategically to prosper from the region's growth. An array of navigable rivers, the Rhine, the Danube, the Elbe, the Oder, and their tributaries, allowed for the economical and rapid movement of goods from the interior of the nation to the coast, facilitating the accumulation of capital at population centers along their banks. This process was accelerated by the Industrial Revolution, mechanization of production, and the expansion of railroads that were most useful in flat areas, such as the European plain. In the late 19th century, Germany emerged as a major continental power, defeating its primary rival France in 1870 and embarking on a drive toward economic and military hegemony. To the east, Germany had to contend with a massive but backward Russian Empire. In the west, it was confronted not only by a wary France, but also by Britain. By the start of the 20th century, France remained a great power, but even with its overseas territories, it could not keep pace with a rising Germany. Britain was most interested in maintaining its vast empire and ensuring that no hegemonic power arose in Europe that could threaten its command of the seas or penetrate its channel moat. Britain had been happy to side with German states in the 1700s and 1800s to maintain a balance of power against the French. With Teutonic ascendancy and the building of the High Seas Fleet, the British backed France to manage the equilibrium. Russia was late to industrialize, but was catching up, and its huge population, vast raw materials, and territorial reach offered significant potential. The Russians were also an imperialist power, looking to secure greater control of the littorals of the Baltic and Black Seas. Such aims were bound to conflict with an equally expansionist Germany, no matter who were the leaders in Moscow and Berlin, or the ideologies that drove them. A peaceful continuation of the status quo was made increasingly unstable by Germany's alliance with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and its kaleidoscope of ethnic nationalities straining for self-determination. A spark was all that was needed to end the peace. That spark was, of course, ignited in Sarajevo in 1914 with the assassination of the Austrian Archduke. So began a 30-year conflict in which Germany fought to vanquish its continental foes and become a preeminent world power. This struggle only concluded with the final defeat of the last fanatical Nazi soldiers around Hitler's Berlin bunker in 1945. At the start of the conflict in 1914, the geography of the European plain determined the scope of plans for German conquest, just as it would in World War II. As the German armies advanced into France in the opening act of the War to End All Wars, the government of Kaiser Wilhelm under its Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg established goals for the conflict in what became known as the September Programme. Despite later protestations that the Allies were just as complicit in the violence of 1914 to 1918, Germany's explicit war aims were aggressive and extreme in scope. In the West, France was to be permanently relieved of its territory along the English Channel, many of its colonies, and its great power status. In addition, French trade with the British Empire would be forbidden, and crippling long-term war reparations would be paid to preclude a potential Gallic rearmament program. Luxembourg was to be annexed, Belgium was to become a dismantled vassal state, and the Netherlands would only survive as an economic dependency. Looking eastward, the German government and its industrial elite concluded that Russia could be defeated first. A separate peace in the east is certain if Italy does not enter the war. But even if Italy does become involved, the moment may arise in certain circumstances when Russia is no longer willing to continue the war, and we can, as a result, conclude a separate agreement with Russia. When this capitulation took place, Germany planned to annex much of Western Russia. In the interest of striking a balance between industry and agriculture, it is also necessary to demand that we obtain new territory in the east, land for settlement, in which new farms could be created for German settlers, and land could be provided as well to German workers who might arrive from Russia. This was a plan to implement what we would now refer to as the war crime of ethnic cleansing. German farmers could only safely move east into newly annexed territories if the established Slavic occupants were forced off their land and into the shrunken remaining domains of the Russian state. The German government realized that such actions would trigger a retaliation by whoever ruled Russia after the war. Thus, much of the German ethnic minority that had been living in the Tsar's domains for centuries would be expelled and could be resettled in the newly conquered eastern lands of the expanded Reich. While the German goals of World War I should in no way exonerate Hitler and his henchmen of the crimes committed in the USSR in 1941 to 1944, it is quite clear that the Nazis were following a path blazed by their predecessors. The greatly expanded German Empire resulting from a successful implementation of the September Programme would dominate the continent through a Mitteleuropa economic union, that would provide for ostensible equality among its members, although it will in fact be under German leadership. It must stabilize Germany's economic predominance in Central Europe. The Kaiser's government also envisioned that its European continental empire would secure shipments of natural resources from newly created Mittelafrika, stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Oceans and made up of then-current German holdings combined with ceded colonial possessions of France, England, and Belgium. What is striking is how neatly the goals of the September Programme match up with the geography of the European plain. By 1943, the Third Reich achieved these aims for a short period. Hitler's armies conquered most of the plain after they seized the littoral along the English Channel and the Bay of Biscay in the west, and then pushed to the Volga River in the east. In both world wars, the Germans were motivated by a perceived need to expand to defendable geographic boundaries. From 1914 to 1918, Germany maximized its three great advantages: interior lines of communications, better artillery, and its Army General Staff, which institutionalized military excellence in planning and battle. These factors allowed the Germans to handily outfight and outkill their opponents. The British, French, and Americans suffered more war dead on the Western Front than the Germans did in all theaters of the conflict. In addition, despite the common view of World War I as static trench warfare, historian John Mosier points out, with each year of war, the Central Powers eliminated a major adversary, destroying its army completely and occupying enormous amounts of its territory. Belgium in 1914, Serbia in 1915, Romania in 1916, Italy in 1917, and, at the end of 1917, Russia as well. Front lines were pushed back away from the German borders, and the Allies were stretched to the breaking point. With the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany secured its territorial goals in Russia and appeared poised to push on to total victory as it redeployed upward of 50 divisions from the eastern to the western front in early 1918. In the spring offensive that followed, the Allied armies were driven back toward Paris, and the Germans seemed on the cusp of victory. However, U.S. troops had begun to arrive in France in late 1917. With them came the first cases of the Spanish flu, which quickly swept across the continent. By the following August, the American Expeditionary Force, with more than 1 million men, went on the offensive against a German army ravaged by disease. In the end, weight of numbers, a starving German population, and an outsized impact of the global influenza pandemic on the Central Powers won out, leading to an armistice. Instead of shearing off territory from its foes, Germany's border shrank as it lost 13% of its national territory and ceded its overseas colonies. Rather than receiving massive war reparations, Berlin had to make economically debilitating payments to the Allies. The empires of the Central Powers were shattered. In light of the goals of the September Programme and the terms of the Brest-Litovsk settlement, the Treaty of Versailles was lenient in comparison. Of course, fair is not how most historians have viewed the agreement that ended the war to end all wars. The deadliest conflict to date in the history of the world was over, and for a time, Germany was defeated in its quest to dominate Europe. It lost all its overseas colonies, as well as a significant chunk of what it considered its home territory to France and Poland. The High Seas Fleet was scuttled, its army reduced in size, and its economy ravaged by hyperinflation. The nation reached a nadir in early 1923. Germany defaulted on its reparations payments, and in response, France militarily occupied the industrial Ruhr region. Few would have believed that 20 years later, Germany would rise to militarily dominate Europe and conquer even more territory than envisioned in the September Programme. The year 1923 is also the year Adolf Hitler found himself confined to a comfortable jail cell in Bavaria. Once there, he began to write Mein Kampf, which envisioned a dramatic recovery for his adopted nation. The geopolitical imperatives of Germany's adversaries. To conquer the European plain and assume the role of a great power, Germany would first have to reconstitute itself and rearm. Then it would have to defeat several enemies.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?